Hi, and welcome to another IB Psychology video, tutorial video with me, your host, Travis Dixon. Today we're going to look at technological techniques, and we're going to look at how we can cut down our content with these too. So, what we're trying to look at here is how can we use the same studies for multiple topics in the biological approach. And being able to do this is one of the best ways you can save hours and hours of revision time. Trying to find the studies that cut across different topics is really important. And I'll make a series of videos that are going to help you see how to exploit these overlaps and really write excellent answers. So what we're looking at here is paper 1. Just a reminder that paper 1 has the 3 approaches: biological, cognitive, social, cultural. We're going to focus on the biological approach, and the tips here are going to be really helpful for your short answer questions, but could also be used for essays as well. So, biological approach, this is what it looks like, but we're going to narrow our focus today, and we're going to focus on the brain and behavior, and even more specifically, these 3 particular topics: techniques, localization, and neuroplasticity. So, techniques. Which techniques do we choose? My first tip is choose fMRI or MRI. The reason for that is I think you definitely want to choose something that's to do with technology, and this is why I would choose one of these two. The image we see here, one or more examples of a technological technique. This comes straight from the IB guide. So things like a true experiment, a case study, animal study, post-mortem study, I wouldn't be using these because they're not about technology. So I think fMRI and MRI is really what you need to focus on here. So that's tip number 1. Now, for these 3 topics, what do you have to be able to explain? We've only really been given the topic localization. Okay, well, what do you have to show? First of all, how and why are one or more techniques used to study the brain? That's what you want to show with techniques. With localization, you have to know an example of localization of function, or what it is as well, and an example of a study, and the same with neuroplasticity. What is neuroplasticity? What is one example, and how can that example be shown in research? So this is what you want to try and explain for these 3 topics. Now, if you want to get mediocre marks, if you're aiming for a 4 or a 5, and for some of you actually that might be fine, that's a lofty goal, and that's okay. All you have to do is state the technique and give an example of a study. You don't have to explain how and why it's used. If you just say an MRI is used to study the brain, here's the study, and you describe that study in detail, you're probably on track to get a 4. But if you want a 6 or a 7, then you need to go further. And the following tips, and if you're watching this video, I think you're probably aiming for that 6 or 7. So, my tip, use the same study and the same explanation for the techniques as you would for either localization or neuroplasticity. Okay, so we're going to double up here, and that's really going to add a lot of depth to your explanation of the technique. All right, so we're looking at the overlaps between these 3 particular topics. Let me give you an example. You could say, technological techniques are used to study localization of function in the, and you'd say the part of the brain which has the function too, and then that way you're going to go in depth here. So you might say, for example, technological techniques are used to study localization of function of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which has the function to allow us to appraise or cognitively reappraise emotional stimuli. Alright, so you're looking at the VMPFC in cognitive appraisal, which is one of the examples I use in my book. Or you might say, technological techniques are used to study neuroplasticity, for example, the effect of socioeconomic status and stress on the amygdala and the hippocampus. Again, that's another example. So if we do localization of function, you would define it. fMRIs are used here to, if you choose fMRI, which part of the brain perform different functions when people are in the machine. MRIs are used to find people with damaged particular areas, and we create comparisons for controls. 2 examples you might be interested in fMRI. I think a good one would be Uri et al. This is looking at the VMPFC in cognitive reappraisal. For MRI, I really like SM's case study with the amygdala and fear, or the Iowa gambling task could also look at the VMPFC, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, in decision making. Couple examples for localization. My recommendation is fMRI. I think fMRI and localization is a good one to use. This is what I've covered in my revision book. In my regular textbook, there's heaps of examples. And so we can see here fMRI is used to find which particular parts of the brain are functioning and are active when we perform particular functions. That's how and why they're used. Okay. For neuroplasticity, oh, yeah, sorry. So if you're explaining fMRI with, say, Uri, then you're going to explain this example, and then you'd use that for localization, and you'd use that for how an fMRI is used to study the brain and behavior, because it's used to study localization, right? There's the double up. Neuroplasticity, if you want to double up techniques and neuroplasticity, well then you can say you define neuroplasticity, our brain's ability to change as a result of experience, and the fMRI, the MRI, the technology is used to measure the before and after. It's used to measure the change. So for example, the fMRI can be used to measure the change in activity, MRI is used to measure the change in structure. Examples of this being used are McNamara and the effects of SSRIs, drug treatments and how they change the brain, or MRI and Luby et al. Study on socioeconomic status. My recommendation is Luby et al. Socioeconomic status. I think this is a good one, and I think Luby's study can be used in multiple topics in this course. Now, you could look really hard maybe and find one study and one example that shows techniques, localization, and neuroplasticity, but honestly, I think you're getting greedy. I would just choose one of these two that you're most confident with, and then link it with it, and then overlap that with the techniques. Don't try and have the same study for all three. Maybe there is a great study out there, maybe there's great examples, maybe you've learned it, but I know in my resources and the course that I've taught in the revision book, everything I've got, it's better, I think, if you just choose one of these two to double over with techniques. Okay. Now, of course, if you're writing an essay on techniques to study the brain, you could use two examples for sure, but for short answer responses, I think it's better to separate them. Okay, and so this is just an example of how in MRI we find the people with the damaged brains, and then we can also find people with healthy brains, and that creates a different groups for comparison. Now, if this was helpful, you might be interested in our revision guide. This is what, say, the topic techniques to study the brain looks like. We've got the key details here, or a brief overview of a summary. Up here is what you need to be able to explain. So this is like your learning outcome. The key details, definitions of key terms in the summary, then the studies that support that, plus exam tips like the one I'm giving you now. Now, if you're only doing the short answer response for techniques, for the biological approach, then you would only use this first page. But if you're studying the biological approach for your essay, then you would turn over the page and you've got all the extra stuff here you need to add to it for an essay. So I would hope that I tried to make this structure deliberate to be helpful. So you've got short answer response requirements on one side, turn it over, and that's what you need for the essay. Additional studies, and then your critical thinking considerations for your counter arguments and to show your critical thinking. All right, you can find that on our store, link in the, what are they called? Comments. Okay, some bonus overlaps. Now, you can also use this to overlap with research methods and ethical considerations. For example, Uri et al. Study uses fMRI in a true experiment. So you could explain how a true experiment's used, and then how true experiments utilize the use of fMRI in studying the brain and behavior. You can also then talk about the ethical consideration of giving informed consent. How much information do you give participants before you do these brain scans? Or if you're doing MRI, you could talk about this as a correlational study, and we correlate environmental factors with brain development, and the importance of anonymity in such studies when you are studying people's brains and this personal information. So we can see here, not only are we finding topics in the brain and behavior, but we can overlap it with the ethical considerations and research methods. Just remember, ethical considerations and research methods might be asked in connection to the topics, or maybe even into connection to the whole approach. They won't be asked in relation to these specific content points. So with those overlaps, what you've done is you can choose one of those examples, fMRI or MRI, and you can use one study, and you can explain how techniques are used. You can choose one of these two, and your ethical considerations, research methods are done. Voila. 4 topics out of 11. You're looking at, about 30% of the biological approach done with just one example. So I'll keep making heaps of videos that show these overlaps and how you can exploit it. And again, it's not just about cutting content for your exams. Okay, this is also about developing a depth of understanding of these topics in psychology. All right, so if you choose fewer, you can go in more depth and show deeper understanding, which I think is the key to getting 6s and 7s and really high grades and becoming a great psychologist. Now, some bonus overlaps I'll put in the next video about neurotransmitters and hormones, and how you could use those to overlink with the techniques to study the brain, and also with research methods and ethics. So subscribe or whatever you need to do in order to make sure notifications so you get the next video. So just a review of those tips. Choose one technique, and the reason to choose one is because the question will say one or more. So you want to have one in depth, so that you can write the short answer response and the essay about it. Okay, I think if you choose 2, then you're going to have too much. And if the question asks, say, an essay, evaluate one technique, well, then the second one maybe a bit of waste of time. But I might contradict myself in a second. So 1 in depth. Short answer questions, 1 study, 1 example. That's it. Especially if you're only doing the biological approach to the short answer question level, and you're going to write your essay on the cognitive or social cultural. 1 study, 1 example. And I would choose the technique and then link that with how it's used to study neuroplasticity, or how it's used to study localization of function. That's for a short answer response. For an essay, you would add a 2nd or 3rd study that's relevant, and you might have 1 or 2 examples. So you're going to write an essay on the fMRI, and then you could talk about how it's used in neuroplasticity or localization with different studies. What you might also want to do, so if you are going to write about the essay, I would recommend studying a second technique. I've just contradicted myself, I know, but it's useful to study limitations, to show the limitations, because you can evaluate fMRI by saying, yes, it shows activity, but it doesn't tell us anything about the structure, and there are some limitations with that the fMRI, the MRI can help us with. Or you could evaluate the MRI by saying, look, it shows us the structure, but it doesn't tell us anything about ongoing activity, and that's how we can use the fMRI. So if you are preparing for the essay, that can be a good technique as well. Right, I really hope that was helpful. If it was, then there's loads of information on the brain, and looky here, one I published just a couple of days ago is all about fMRI and giving you more information there. So links in the description, you can click on that. I really hope that was helpful. Again, we've got our revision book coming out, and that'll be in the store. You can check out previews there. And good luck for your exams. Well done for watching. Keep working hard. The key to success in IB psychology. There's a lot to get through, but keep working at it. Keep working hard. Good luck.